World History Discussions, Chapter 7, Part 7 on the later Persian Empires. We started talking about the rise of Parthia at the end of the last discussion video, so now we're going to talk about peak Parthia in green and the empire that followed them, the Sasanians, in purple. So, as I mentioned, in 238 BCE, the Parthians rise. It's not till 83 BCE that the Seleucids are completely wiped out by the Romans, so there's a coexistence for a couple hundred years. But under the rule of Mithridates I, Parthians overshadow the Seleucids in Persia, and that's between 171 and 155 BCE. Parthians justified their rule by portraying themselves as enemies of the foreign Seleucids and restorers of Persian rule, which was partly true. They made a new capital at Ctesiphon, I think that's how you pronounce that, which is near modern-day Baghdad, and they governed through satraps and used Achaemenid taxation and administration. However, the Parthians also retained many of the steppe traditions, such as being less centralized and depended on clan leaders who served as satraps, and occasionally would fight against each other, sometimes with two rivals claiming the crown at the same time. For the next 3 centuries, the Parthians ruled a powerful empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. As you're going to see when we get to chapter 12, they're a big middleman on the Silk Road between Rome and Han China, because they're semi-nomadic, as are the Kushans of northern India, also semi-nomadic middlemen on the Silk Roads. However, by the 1st century CE, the Romans to the west were putting pressure on the Parthians while expanding. Parthian military was too powerful and the empire too vast to be in any danger of being conquered by the Romans. However, during the 100s CE, on 3 occasions, the Romans captured the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon. Remember that the 117, when we get to chapter 11, 117 was the peak of the Roman Empire, when they stretched all the way from Hadrian's Wall in England to occasionally Mesopotamia, when they were able to briefly conquer bits and pieces of the Parthian Empire. But the Parthians managed to hold their own against the Romans. However, internal rebellion and eventually in 224 CE conquest by the Sasanians brought the Parthian Empire down. So the final Persian Empire is the one in purple, the Sasanian Empire, which ruled from 224 to 651 CE, and they recreated much of the splendor of the Achaemenid Empire. They ruled from Parthia to Mesopotamia with a capital at Ctesiphon, just like the Parthians had had, and they claimed to be direct descendants of the Achaemenids. They peaked under Shapur I, who ruled from 239 to 272 CE, and created a series of buffer states between themselves and the Roman Empire, which was actually weakening at this point, as you'll see in chapter 11 and chapter 12 on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So Shapur even defeated several Roman armies, and then he captured them and used their engineering skills of the Roman prisoners to build roads and dams. After Shapur's reign, the Sasanians entered a standoffish relationship both with the remains of the Kushan Empire to the east and with the Roman and later the Byzantine empires to the west. However, none of these empires was large or strong enough to overcome the other, but they contested border areas and buffer states. These disputes weakened all of the empires involved, but especially the Sasanians, who were right in the middle. And finally, the Sasanian Empire ended in 651 CE, when Arab Muslims killed the last Sasanian ruler, overran his realm, and incorporated into the quickly expanding Islamic empire. This would be the Rashidian Caliphate. We'll get to them way up there in chapter 14. However, even the Arab conquerors adopted Persian administrative techniques in their new Islamic society, and that is why we call these the classical empires, because even though these are old societies, their traditions continued well after they collapsed, and especially in those parts of the world. And the Persian Achaemenid Empire was no exception. So now that we've gone through a little over 1,000 years of Persian history, I'll briefly sum it up. The Achaemenids from 550s to 330 BCE. The Greek Seleucids from 330 to 83 BCE. The Parthians from 238 BCE to 224 CE, and the Sasanians 224 to 651. Now we'll talk about Persian culture.